We're on the brink of summer, it feels like. The freedom of it is upon us. Might be the chance of a change of scenery, getting outside more, change of routine maybe, or maybe even a holiday, a chance to lighten the load. At our dinner table the other night, someone said they were launching into the summer, and I thought, launching? Wow. Kind of feel like I'm stumbling, but whether you're stepping out, you're launching out, or you're falling into the summer, we could do with a break in life, couldn't we? Life can be hard and heavy enough at times. We could do with a rest. We could leave our burdens behind. This promise of summer, it really is similar to the promise or the invitation of Sabbath. Welcome the day, receive the gift. Remember the Sabbath and keep it. It is made for you, your freedom, your joy, your healing. Blessed be God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who restores our soul and commands us to rest. It's a prayer from a little book of Celtic daily prayers that I use to kind of bring me into my time off in the week. It encourages us to carry no burdens on this Sabbath day. So to let your work and your worries, your responsibilities, your sin fall away. This is our final walk this morning in page 1, if you like, Genesis 1 to 3. It's our final walk out across that in our series on being human. And I have to be honest today that I'm a little bit blind as a guide to you. Now, I have confidence that I have the light of the scriptures to help us in rest today. But normally when it comes to these topics, I like to think I have some kind of idea of where you're coming from on it. You know, like what your faith background or what previous things have maybe, how it's shaped your thinking. But I have to be honest, I'm not quite sure with Sabbath. I don't know what the word Sabbath even does to you when you hear it. What you think about it, how you practice it. Let me say today, if you're coming with an idea that Sabbath is the strict observance of a day in which you do no work, and it seems to be drained of little joy in life and it squeezes you, open your mind a little to the message today to let the Lord redeem this word for you. My prayer is you might prize the rest it brings. But also, if you're coming with a sure attitude, the Sabbath belongs to a time in the past somewhere, or that Christians have freedom and we're not required to keep the Sabbath, let me encourage you to maybe stick with me a little bit as we consider the Sabbath as a pattern we are to practice. We're thinking today about rest. If the word Sabbath is getting in your way, just every time I say that, just hear rest, okay? In praise of Sabbath rest. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He created all there is. The eternal one who existed before the world created, as well as this place, he created time. Right from the beginning on day 1, verse 3 of Genesis 1, if you have it in front of you there. God said, "Let there be light." There was light. God saw the light was good. He separated the light from darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. The first thing God does is creates day and night. Then in the middle of this Genesis 1 creation story, on day 4, he fills the day and night with sun, moon and stars. Verse 14, he says, "Let them serve as signs to mark the sacred times, days and years." And so the sun orders our days as the earth spins around it. We've got 24 hours. As we make our way around it, we've got our seasons. The moon in the sky affects our tides and our seasons too. And this would have sounded different to the original audience of Genesis, where the worship of the sun, the moon and the stars as deities, as gods, was common. In fact, a practice common enough to where we are here in Ireland before Christianity came. Druids did the same. But in this account, the sun and moon and stars are placed here by God, by his hands. He is the one who places them. He creates time and order, and he creates it good. So at the end of the chapter we see, having made humans in his image last of all on day 6, verse 31, God saw all that he had made and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 6th day. Thus the heavens and earth were completed in all their vast array. By the 7th day God had finished the work he'd been doing. So on the 7th day he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. God himself rested. Not because, like me stumbling into the summer, he was stumbling and exhausted. Not because he needed to recover. That's not what we see in this account. God speaks things into being. It's not what we see across the scriptures. In Isaiah 40:28 we read, "The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary." He doesn't rest because he has to recover from being exhausted. He rests because that's it. He has no more to do. This is his good creation. He couldn't add to it at all. He's finished it. He's completed it. He knows when to stop. Rest here in the language comes from the Hebrew term Shabbat, which means to cease, to stop. He stopped. And he does this on day 7. That number which in Hebrew culture speaks of completion, of perfection. But also we heard a few weeks ago of holiness. The number 7 was associated with temples, with holy places. So the garden and the world itself is created holy to the Lord, his home. But here is a time to be created as holy to him in verse 3. Distinct from the other days then. That's what holy means, but it also means it belongs to him. This is the start of the book of the law, the collection of the first 5 books of the Bible. And as we carry on, we see how God's people are to worship him, how they are to be holy to him. And it involves having a break from their ordinary work to worship him. And in fact, these 5 books finish with God's people on the cusp of the promised land, being freed from slavery, and they receive the law to instruct them how to live as a people holy to the Lord and distinct to him. So in Exodus 20, just fresh out of Egypt, and at Mount Sinai, God gives these words to Moses. In Exodus 20 verse 2, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." And then in verse 8 we read in Exodus 20, "Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. 6 days you shall labour and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, your son or daughter, your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and he made it holy." And so this command that we have over in Exodus, we have this Genesis account that's written, I think, in a way that shows that God rests on the 7th day, just as they are to. Indeed, we as humans are all in God's image, and so, as Tim Chester says, rest is godly because rest is God-like. We rest because God himself rested. Now, I've stated before that Genesis 1 is not a science textbook. It is a different cosmic creation story common at the time. And so, it's not to be read literally that there are 7 days like this. Okay? It does allow that this is written as a pattern, and it speaks about a different length of time. I'm stepping into water here I can't fully actually unpack this morning, but I do want to let you know that I'm not just standing here in the middle and going, I'm not going to take an opinion on this. I'm actually not willing to go beyond what I think that Bible story at the beginning of Genesis is for. And I think it's not giving us a science account of the beginning of the world. It is showing us who God is. It is showing us our place in the world. It's actually speaking to us about identity. We didn't come to these verses kind of going, oh, we're going to look at identity and it kind of works at the start of the Bible. Actually, that's what these chapters are talking about. And so, when you look through these verses, I think that what Genesis 1 is telling us is the who of creation, who God is. It's telling us that more, and it is telling us about how he made it and shaped it, but not necessarily in the detail that gets us down to that scientific, how old is the world. I actually think you can read Genesis 1 and you can still hold either view. Genesis 1 can be read in a way that allows for a long time. Genesis 1 can also be read in a way that allows for 6 days. But it's actually not the main point it's making. But the reason I've gone there is to say I'm available if you want to chat more about that, or you want to think more about that, to see what you think on that. But when it comes to Sabbath or rest, let me invite you to think of this. If you think the world is being not literally, if you think God did create it in 6 days, why did he choose that number? Why did he choose to create it in 6 and rest the 7? And even more so, if you think it took a lot longer, why was it written into a week? I find that fascinating. Why was it written into a week? Is it just to say that the number 7 shows holiness and completeness in the Hebrew culture? Or has the whole thing been written to show the very importance of rest and the Sabbath day? Why did this matter so much? Well, more than 40 years later, unfortunately, God's people, there's a generation of them die in the wilderness because they refused to step forward with faith. And so these words are reminded, are refreshed to the people in Deuteronomy chapter 5, the same commands attached to Sabbath, but this time, rather than recalling creation, it says this: remember that you were slaves in Egypt, that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Stop working, it says, and remember who you are. Remember who you were created to be. That's the Exodus command. And remember who you were redeemed to be. That is the Deuteronomy command. Or a bit simpler, remember you are not slaves. You are free. You're not a slave to your work. You don't live to work like that. It's a bittersweet symphony, that's life. I'll not sing it for you. Trying to make ends meet. You're a slave to your money, then you die. That's in my head now. Put it in your head for the day. But there's some of that still carries, isn't it? You know, we live like that in our wider culture. And maybe you feel that sometimes. Maybe you're working hard, and maybe even you see signs of injustice in how you're working, trying to make ends meet when the cost of living and accommodation is so high and it feels heavy. You feel a bit enslaved and trapped. Or maybe it's the choices we make in our lifestyles actually sometimes that means we have to work so hard to keep our heads above the water or to get free from some of our debt, and it feels like we're trapped and heavy. Or maybe it's because the secular story says there's no real meaning in life. There's no real significance to be found, and so the only reason you work really is just to get money. We feel a bit trapped. It feels heavy. But Sabbath or rest is God's good gift to us to help us remember who we are. Not slaves, but free. And so when I have read across the scriptures before, I'm always fascinated by how much Sabbath seems to matter. More than I expect it would. So you read through the prophets and they're warning God's people to come back, to keep his words. God is continually talking to them about how they keep Sabbath. And I'm thinking, really? I get all the other injustices, I get all the other bits, but why is this day important to you? Why is it so important? Or when Jesus comes and Jesus clashes with the religious leaders on so many different things, He's regularly doing it on the Sabbath, about the Sabbath. It shows an importance to him. It's a gift to us to remind us of who we are, but it's also a way in which we live holy to the Lord and show who he is. God's people were to be different by how they kept this one day. How they rested was to show that they were free. It was to honour what the Lord had done and glorify him. We'll move to pursuing Sabbath rest or practicing it. If rest is found in Eden in the very good beginning of our story as humans, sadly, we also read of it being lost, as Adam and Eve were banished in chapter 3. And in the very next chapter, Cain murders Abel, and in verse 12 of chapter 4, he becomes a restless wanderer on the earth. And in many ways, our weakness as humans, being born into sin, we follow in his footsteps. We are restless wanderers. Yet God rescues his people from Egypt to bring them to a land they would call home, a place where they would know rest. And so after the times of Joshua and Judges, and then Saul as the first king, we come to David's time, and as David's enemies are defeated, we read that they knew rest. They knew this rest. And yet, in Solomon's time, the kingdom is divided, and as the kings came and went, they're straying. God's people are straying from him. And despite warnings, they leave that rest. Their rest is lost. They're exiled from their home. And yes, at the close of the Old Testament, some of God's people had returned, but restoration is only partial. Rest comes when Jesus comes. And we find that rest is no longer attached to a particular promised place, but rather to his person. He is the one who brings us rest. And he went to war with certain religious leaders over it. They claimed authority over the Sabbath. They'd not only kept the Sabbath, but they decided to draw another set of rules around it to make sure they wouldn't break Sabbath. They hedged it in with their own commands. Their restrictive religious legalism was most clearly seen in the Sabbath, and Jesus took it head on to free people. Jesus refused to keep their man-made laws. He provoked them by healing on the Sabbath. He challenged their understanding of it. And then in Mark chapter 2, verse 28, he claims the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Do you know how to want to annoy someone? Or clash with them and say, hey, who's in charge here? And he says in the verse before this, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Sabbath was made for freedom. It wasn't made to enslave us in rules. And so these religious leaders, their teaching and way of life, their way of doing things was described as a yoke. It was a yoke that you put on and followed. A yoke that was heavy on the people. And so Jesus says this in Matthew 11, verse 28. You'll know these words likely. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke on you. Learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke, my way, is easy, and my burden is light. Jesus wasn't only Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus was the one who fulfilled it, as well as being a keeper of it himself. The Sabbath kind of brings us to him. But where do we find this Sabbath now? Maybe more when? How does it look in our lives? In Hebrews 4, the rest of Sabbath is compared to how God's people rejected his word in the Old Testament and failed to enter their promised rest. And so we have read this morning in Hebrews 4 verse 9, there remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Anyone who enters God's rest rests from their works, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. So in verse 10 there you heard that rest is entered by those who've trusted in Jesus. He has finished his work. He cried out on the cross, it is finished. And when he has ascended to God, he sits down at God's right hand. I think I've heard someone say, because he sits down and he is finished, it means we can sit down. It means we can cease from trying to prove ourselves with our work, because he has done it for us. He has rescued us. And yet we are to make every effort to enter it, because it takes effort in our lives, but also because the Sabbath remains ahead of us still. Some of it now, but it's ahead of us still. In Genesis, the story of creation, day 7 was different. Do you know the evening and morning in day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you hear that it actually isn't at the end of day 7. Day 7 didn't have that finish to it. It was open-ended. The world was created for us to enter that rest. And now as we know that unrest because of the fall, what Sabbath offers us is a taste not only of what the world was, but of what it will be. So as we practice rest in our lives, it tells us the story of who we were made to be, who we were redeemed to be, and who we will one day in the end be fully restored to be. There is no doubting today that many people are looking for this rest. You know that story, you hear it all around you, the work-life balance. Or people are looking for a more holistic view on life. It's more than work, it's got to do with your health, it's got to do with your relationships. And yet seeking this is one thing, practicing is another. I've certainly found that. Really helpful book on this by Adam Mabry, which is called The Art of Rest. And even just the title gives you something. He talks about this being a bit of an art form. It's not a science, it's an art that we learn along the way in life. But it got me wondering why we find it so hard to find our way into rest when we long for it so much. Can it be because we just can't stop working? We get into rhythms of working to be so successful that it can just be, and just keep going, that it can be hard to break that. But we can also be working deeper, working to earn the love and affection of others around us, or working to earn God's love, actually, trying to please him. We can even be working to prove ourselves, maybe even prove ourselves to ourselves sometimes, or to cover sin and shame that we have in our lives. We are primed and prone to work to make ourselves at peace, and yet the good news of Jesus is that we can know rest. And practicing rest in our lives is a way of us acting ourselves into a different way of thinking and feeling that the gospel brings. When, though? Some people have very precise and particular views on this. You might be one of them. Inviting conversation afterwards. Some people will argue that Sabbath must be a Sunday, the day on which Jesus rose, replacing the Jewish Sabbath of Saturday. Others might say, well, look, it doesn't need to be that day, but one day in 7 we need to take off. Others might feel we've more freedom in that we just need to have rest in our lives. But the principle of Sabbath remains. Well, let me say there's some genuine Christian freedom in these beliefs. Colossians 2 verse 16, therefore do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. Jesus has fulfilled the Sabbath. For me, I think that regular rhythms of rest are an important part of what it means to be human. If God, the one who created us, rested, and we're made in his image, well then I think there's something for our good that we rest. I would suggest that the more fully we capture this in a 1 and 7 kind of rhythm, 1 a week, the better. But that can be difficult. I'll get there in a moment. If you're not sure about this, let me ask you to consider this. Why was the creation account in Genesis written like it was in that sevenfold sequence, do you think, to emphasize rest? And maybe just to say that some of the early Christians in Rome actually had a reputation. They had a reputation for being lazy. When everybody else was trading every day of the week, the Christians wouldn't trade in one day. And they were written off, look at those lazy ones over there. It's an interesting thought to me that sometimes it might look like being lazy. We covered work and working hard and well last week. So from at least the start of the Christian church, some Christians were Sabbathing, if you like, 1 and 7. What might practicing Sabbath though look like? Well, resting. It could be one day each week, but it could actually be a little pocket of time each day. It could be a little bit longer each year on holidays. It could be even a little bit longer if you have the opportunity to take extended leave from work every, 5, 6, 7 years, sabbaticals, sometimes called. So it doesn't always mean in a week. The principle of Sabbath, though, is to say no to work, to have boundaries which might include us setting aside the work that hangs heavy on us, or maybe even setting aside things that distract us, so that we might be present and at peace with others. But what I'd love you just to consider today is that Sabbath isn't just saying no, but Sabbath is saying a huge yes. It's saying yes to life-giving things that God gives us, that we can delight in and enjoy. Worshipping God, especially with others, spending time with friends and family, enjoying time outdoors, whether that be up a mountain or in the sea or wherever it be. Being quiet and doing the things you enjoy, reading or going to movies. And then there's work that isn't work. Maybe it's the work in the garden. For some people it seems like real hard work. For others it's something that gives life. Or the work of being creative, lifting a guitar and playing it, even if it's neglected most of the time. The work of making something. But let me say I recognise not everyone has the same opportunity and freedom to do this. With work and family commitments, especially when kids are young, it can be very difficult to capture this in a day. And I don't, just to be personal and real with you. There's aspects of Sabbath that we have across a week. We have a family day off. But this, on a Sunday, for me, is part of that. Sabbath. And then I have a morning off each week. And those different things kind of, if you like, added together, bring some of this across for me at this stage in life. How might you be able to practice a rhythm of this that's realistic? And to act ourselves into a different way of thinking. We're wrapping up today. And these past weeks, we've considered what it means to be human. We've unearthed many of the current stories in our culture which present different ideas on what flourishing looks like and freedom. And as we've done this in the Bible's beginning, my prayer is that you might see more clearly and more confidently that the Christian message is a better story of who we are as humans, and is one in which we can find true freedom and flourishing. We've thought about worship and worth and weakness in the first 3 chapters. Then we took a prolonged time to think about home. I spent more time there than I thought I might as we looked at this planet as our home, the outdoors, the garden of creation, this particular place that God has placed us, and God making this home in us. We've also thought of relationships, of family and friends, of gender and of sexuality. And then these last couple of weeks we've thought about rhythms of work and rest. So this is a holistic story of our identity, if you like, or some aspects, it's probably not them all. But we've walked around Eden Garden. And sometimes these have led to paths that have led us out across the Bible, because the Bible is written with certain themes at the start, which it continues and develops across it. But I'm hoping that this is a garden in which we have walked with God, because we found the person of Jesus here. And in many ways it's fitting that we finish with Sabbath, because when I was thinking about it, much of what we might find restful and refreshing actually maybe is echoes of the garden in the beginning. Which is to say that practicing Sabbath helps reset and recover our story as humans, or practicing rest. And I hope the talks have refreshed you, but I want to acknowledge that many of these messages have asked you to dig a little bit to find water. The well hasn't just been gushing up for you. There's been a little bit to digest to them. The messages are available on YouTube if you'd like to pick up on them again or listen to anything you've missed. And I'd love to hear how you felt the Lord has been speaking to you through them, what He's been encouraging or challenging, or have a conversation about them. But as we finish, let me say that Sabbath and rest are important because they're not just contained to a day, they overflow into the rest of our lives. So we might know even rest in our work, freedom across our lives. The book I'd written, Recovering Life, was about a recovery period in my life, which feels a little bit like a Sabbath. It's not quite a Sabbath, but it has aspects of it. And a friend and fellow pastor, when he read the book, described it like this. He said it presents the Christian life as a lived out refreshment and not a grinding religious performance. It takes someone else to see something sometimes, but I thought if I've captured anything like that, I'd be very happy. But let me park my book aside and say, a lived out refreshing and not a grinding religious performance is what Sabbath offers us. How we spend our time as humans shows something of the story we hold to be true. It says something about us. More than just a time set aside for God and for our good, these times of rest are not just a pattern, but they can be a picture of a way of life with Jesus. A picture that's a lived out refreshment and not a grinding religious performance. That would be my prayer, that you might know more of that, even this summer, that we might know more of that as a church family as we travel forward together, that we show what it is to live lightly and freely with Jesus.